The operating tent at Forward Operating Base Chapman smelled of blood, diesel, and death. A 4-star general was hemorrhaging on a gurney, his bodyguard's hand hovering over his weapon, demanding a surgeon. The only person who stepped forward was a 26-year-old combat nurse named Claire Abernathy. Late August in Coast Province was never forgiving. The heat alone could break a man. But today, the real killer wasn't the temperature or the Taliban. It was an IED-riddled stretch of route Tampa that had swallowed a command convoy whole and spat it back in pieces. Inside the trauma bay of FOB Chapman, the fluorescent lights flickered against canvas walls, casting pale yellow light over rows of wounded soldiers. The air tasted of copper and burned rubber. First Lieutenant Claire Abernathy had been on shift for 14 hours straight. Her uniform was soaked through, her boots sticky with someone else's blood. At 26 she moved through the chaos with quiet, mechanical efficiency, checking lines, calling vitals, directing the flow of the broken and the bleeding. Outside, a haboob had consumed the horizon. A biblical wall of sand, 400 feet tall, had swallowed the base hole, dropping visibility to zero and grounding every Black Hawk on the flight line. The desert had sealed them in. Then the mass casualty alarm detonated over the loudspeakers. Corporal Higgins burst through the tent flaps, his face white beneath the grime. Claire convoy hit multiple IEDs, coordinated ambush. It's bad. He stopped, swallowed. General Gallagher was with them. The name landed like a grenade in a quiet room. General Nicholas Gallagher, 4 stars, commander of the 82nd Airborne, the man personally architecting the entire regional counterinsurgency campaign. He was not supposed to be outside the wire. He never was. But Gallagher had always been the kind of general who led from the front, whether his security detail liked it or not. Before Claire could respond, the double doors exploded inward. A tightly packed cluster of armored personnel flooded the trauma bay, parting around a gurney that moved fast and low. On it lay General Gallagher. His face, typically carved from stone and authority, was now slack and grey, drained of every drop of color. His body armor had been partially cut away, and the field dressings packed against his right side were already soaked black-red and failing. Flanking the gurney, covered in the general's blood from collar to boot, was Colonel Richard Hayes, Gallagher's aide-de-camp, former ranger, a man whose reputation for ruthless, merciless efficiency was known from Kabul to the Pentagon. Right now, that same man was barely holding himself together, his eyes wild with a terror he didn't have the tools to process. "I need the chief of surgery. Right now." Hayes's voice carved through the noise like a blade. "Where is the doctor?" Claire moved to the gurney instantly, her stethoscope already in her ears, her gloved hands tearing at the remaining body armor buckles. "Talk to me, Higgins. Vitals. BP, 70/40 and dropping. Heart rate 140, thready." Higgins rattled off, slamming the monitor leads onto Gallagher's chest. "Right upper quadrant. Shrapnel. No exit wound. Get your hands off him." Hayes grabbed Claire by the shoulder and spun her around hard. "You're a nurse. I need a doctor. Get me the surgeon." Claire ripped his hand away with a force that snapped his head back. "Touch me in my trauma bay again, Colonel, and I will have you removed. Step back." She turned immediately to the portable ultrasound, squeezing gel onto Gallagher's rigid abdomen and pressing the probe against his skin. The fast exam flickered on the screen. The image hit her like ice water. Dark, expanding pools of fluid everywhere. Free-flowing blood filling the abdominal cavity at a catastrophic rate. The shrapnel had detonated through his liver like a small bomb. "Grade 4, hypovolemic shock," Claire said, her voice dropping to a register so calm it was frightening. "Massive hepatic laceration. He is bleeding internally at a rate that is not survivable without immediate surgical intervention. Then medevac him. Call the birds," Hayes barked, turning to his radio operator. Colonel Claire pointed at the tent walls, shaking and snapping in the fury of the sandstorm outside. "There are no birds. A Black Hawk's rotors would shred in that air. We are sealed in. There is no flying tonight." The monitors erupted into rapid, piercing alarms. Gallagher's pressure had collapsed to 60/30. His lips were going pale. His eyes were beginning to lose focus. Claire looked across the tent. Major Samuel Eris, the base's only trauma surgeon, was clamped to a shredded aorta on the adjacent table, his hands deep in the open chest of a 20-year-old sniper. He had been there for 2 hours. He would be there for 2 more. If he stepped away now, the young soldier would be dead before his hands cleared the surgical field. There was no one else. Claire reached a decision the way a doctor does, not emotionally, not dramatically, but with the cold, complete logic of someone who can see exactly how many heartbeats remain and what it costs to waste even one of them. Higgins, her voice cut clean and clear through the noise. 1 unit of O negative on the rapid infuser. Push a gram of TXA. Open a laparotomy tray. I need a Hassan 0 blade, Kelly clamps, and heavy suction. Now. Higgins froze. Lieutenant, we don't have a surgeon. I know. Claire was already tearing into a sterile gown pack, shoving her arms through the sleeves. Gloves. What do you think you are doing? Hayes stepped directly into her path, his body blocking the surgical tray. You are a nurse, Lieutenant. You are not authorized to open a United States general. I will not allow it. Claire stopped. She looked at him, and for a single, unguarded moment, the mask slipped. Nobody in that tent, nobody in the entire United States Army, knew the truth about Claire Abernathy. Her service file listed a bachelor's degree in nursing from a state school. A clean, ordinary record. A carefully constructed fiction buried beneath 3 years of quiet, deliberate invisibility. The truth was different. 3 years ago, her name came with a title. Dr. Claire Abernathy, M.D., third-year surgical resident at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester. A rising talent, with hands that moved like they were guided by something beyond training, and a mind that mapped vascular anatomy the way other people read maps instinctively, completely, without effort. Then Dr. Robert Henderson happened. Henderson was the chief of surgery. Connected, celebrated, and catastrophically arrogant. When he botched a complex bypass on a sitting senator and altered the operative records to erase his own role in the man's death, Claire had found the inconsistency. She had documented it. She had gone to administration. Henderson's response had been surgical in its own right. Claire's younger brother was enrolled in an experimental neurological treatment program, a multi-million-dollar protocol funded entirely through a grant that Henderson controlled. The message delivered to Claire was simple and absolute. Take the blame for the senator's death, surrender her license, disappear, or her brother's treatment ended tomorrow. She had chosen her brother without hesitation. She walked away from medicine, from her career, from her identity, and enrolled in the army under a modified nursing credential, deliberately performing below her ability, hiding in plain sight, counting the days until she could disappear completely from a world that had devoured everything she built. She had not held a surgical scalpel in 3 years, but the human body had not changed, and the man on the table had 4 minutes left. General Gallagher has a hepatic arterial bleed, Claire said, her voice stripped of everything except clinical fact. His systolic pressure is now 40. In 4 minutes, his cerebral perfusion will cease. At that point, resuscitation becomes impossible because there will be nothing left to resuscitate. She paused. Major Iris is managing a live thoracic bleed on the adjacent table. If you pull him, that soldier dies in under 60 seconds. That is your alternative. Colonel, choose. The monitor released a long, dropping tone. 40/20. Hayes's hand moved toward his holster. The Sig Sauer M17 cleared the leather, not fully raised, but leveled. His finger was close to the trigger. The safety was off. Every person in the trauma bay went absolutely still. Stand down, Lieutenant, Hayes said, his voice gone low and dangerous. That is a direct order. Step away from the general. Claire looked at the weapon. Then she looked at Hayes. Shoot me, she said quietly. Hayes blinked. What? Shoot me, she repeated, without any inflection. I fall, he dies, and you spend the rest of your life explaining to the Pentagon, to his family, and to the President exactly why Nicholas Gallagher bled to death on a cot in Afghanistan while you stood 4 feet away, pointing a gun at the woman trying to save him. She held his gaze without blinking. Pull the trigger, or get out of my way, Colonel. 3 seconds passed. The wind hammered the canvas. The monitor beeped, slower and slower, the sound of a life spinning itself down to 0. Hayes lowered the weapon. He didn't speak. He stepped back. His jaw was clenched so tightly it looked ready to crack. But he moved, and the tray was clear. Claire turned back to the table. She picked up the Hassan 0 blade. Her right hand trembled for exactly 1 second. 3 years of grief and suppressed identity, rising briefly to the surface. She closed her eyes. She exhaled. When she opened them, the tremor was gone. Time of incision, 1400 hours, Claire said. Midline laparotomy. The blade entered cleanly. The abdominal cavity opened in a rush of dark, pressurized blood that immediately overwhelmed the surgical drapes and pooled across the floor. The sheer volume of hemorrhage was staggering, the kind of bleeding that ends careers and lives in equal measure. Suction. Hard. Higgins, get the wand in there. Claire drove her hands directly into the cavity, working blind through the blood, feeling for landmarks with a precision that came from somewhere deeper than training. She located the descending aorta at the diaphragm and clamped it manually against the spine with her bare hand, compressing the massive vessel with full force. It was brutal on her forearm, the kind of sustained physical effort that burns muscle within minutes, but it worked. The remaining blood in Gallagher's system was rerouted upward, buying precious time for his brain and heart. Pressure climbing, Higgins called. 45/25 Hayes. Claire didn't look up. Betadine, your hands. Sterile gloves. Right now. The colonel moved without argument. He scrubbed, gloved, and stepped to the table. Follow my arm down into the cavity, Claire directed. Feel where my fingers are pressing against his spine. You are going to take the aorta. Grip it as hard as you can and do not release for any reason. Understood. Hayes swallowed. He reached in, traced her arm, and found the vessel. He squeezed. I have it. Claire pulled her hand free and moved immediately to the liver. The shrapnel had sheared through the right lobe and torn the hepatic artery along a 7-centimeter stretch. She executed a Pringle maneuver, 2 fingers through the epiploic foramen, isolating and pinching the hepatoduodenal ligament, cutting off the liver's blood supply to create a clean operative field. Needle driver. 30 proline. She snapped her palm open. Higgins slapped the instrument into her hand. What followed lasted 11 minutes. Colonel Hayes watched it happen from 18 inches away. His hands buried inside a general's abdomen, and he understood without medical training, without clinical context, without any frame of reference for what he was witnessing, that what Claire was doing was extraordinary. Her hands moved with a fluency that had nothing to do with nursing school. The suture line she threw across that torn artery was fast, precise, and utterly confident, every stitch placed with the quiet authority of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Across the room, Major Arris had finally closed his patient. He stripped his gloves, turned around expecting catastrophe, and instead stood completely motionless for 5 full seconds. He walked slowly toward the second table. He examined the surgical field without speaking. The Pringle maneuver, the aortic compression, the running vascular suture being laid across a hepatic arterial tear with textbook accuracy. Lieutenant Arris said softly, "Where did you learn to throw a suture like that?" "I read a lot, Major," Claire said, without looking up. "Are you going to pack this liver, or are we going to have a conversation?" Arris grabbed the lap sponges and got to work. Artery repaired. Releasing the ligament, Claire snipped the final thread. The field held. No fresh arterial hemorrhage. The bleeding had stopped. Hayes released the aorta slowly. The colonel eased his grip. The monitors climbed. 70/40, then 85/50, then 100/65. General Gallagher's heart found its rhythm and held it strong, steady, and stubbornly alive. Hayes withdrew his hands and sat down hard in a folding chair behind him, his face completely emptied of the rage and arrogance that had defined it an hour ago. He stared at Claire as she stepped back from the table, stripped her gloves, and tossed them into the biohazard bin. Arris leaned over the surgical field, examining the arterial repair in silence. It was flawless, not competent, not adequate. Flawless, the kind of repair a vascular fellow produces after years of dedicated subspecialty training. He looked up at her. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. Outside, the haboob had finally broken. The wind dropped to a low hollow whistle, and over the radio, a tinny voice announced the Medevac birds were spooling up on the flight line. Claire pulled the bloody gown from her shoulders and dropped it in the bin. "Just a nurse, Major." She walked toward the door without looking back. "Get him packaged for transport." 2 weeks later, Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, the surgical team that reopened General Gallagher for a follow-up procedure in Maryland, stood around a lightbox in complete silence, studying the imaging. The hepatic arterial repair was precise, clean, and structurally sound. The attending vascular surgeon on the review panel, a man with 30 years and 2 fellowship appointments behind him, called it the finest field repair he had ever examined from a combat theater. Major Arris had documented everything in his after-action report. He had not performed the repair. He had assisted. General Gallagher read the report 3 times. Then he picked up the phone and called the Defense Intelligence Agency. The federal investigation took 11 weeks. When FBI agents arrived at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester with warrants, they found exactly what Claire had found 3 years earlier, and everything Henderson had subsequently buried: the original, unaltered operative logs from the senator's surgery. Internal communications documenting the grant leverage used against Claire. Financial records, witness testimony from 2 former residents who had been quietly afraid for years. Robert Henderson was arrested on a Tuesday morning. Federal charges, wire fraud, extortion, and obstruction of justice. His grant portfolio was frozen within the hour. The Minnesota Medical Licensing Board received the evidentiary package from the FBI the following week. Their review took 4 days. 3 months after Fob Chapman, First Lieutenant Claire Abernathy stood at parade rest inside a briefing room at Fort Bragg. Certain she was about to be arrested, she had run the math 100 times. Practicing medicine without a license in a combat zone. Performing unsupervised surgery on a 4-star general. The case against her was objectively strong. She had made peace with it. She had saved his life, and she would face whatever followed. The door opened. General Nicholas Gallagher walked in under his own power. Back straight, color returned, followed closely by Colonel Richard Hayes. Claire came to attention and saluted sharply. Gallagher returned the salute and gestured her to ease. He set a thick manila folder on the briefing table and looked at her for a long, quiet moment. The chief of vascular surgery at Walter Reed, Gallagher said, told me that whoever repaired my hepatic artery in that tent performed a reconstruction that he would teach in a fellowship program. He used the word masterwork. He paused. Dr. Robert Henderson was indicted by a federal grand jury 14 days ago. The original surgical logs have been recovered and authenticated. The medical board in Minnesota has formally reviewed the evidence. He reached into the folder and slid a document across the table. Claire looked down at it. Heavy cream parchment. An embossed seal. Her name, printed in clean black type across the top. Dr. Claire Abernathy, MD active, reinstated, unconditional. You gave up your future to protect your brother, Gallagher said. And then you gave up your freedom to save a man you had never met and had no obligation to. That is not something I am able to walk away from and call it even. Hayes stepped forward. He opened a small velvet box. Inside, the Army Commendation Medal with a V device caught the fluorescent light. The man who had pressed a loaded weapon against her chest 3 months ago looked her directly in the eye. It was an honor to hold the aorta, Doctor. The tears came before Claire could stop them, and she didn't try. 3 years of grief, of smallness, of deliberate invisibility, released all at once in a single long exhale. She looked at the medal. She looked at her license. She was Dr. Claire Abernathy again, and she was never disappearing again.